The loner rancher waited for his mail-order bride, a surprising twist in Wild West stories. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. In Wyoming, where the wind cuts across the face and red dust buries every dream, a lonely rancher sends a letter in search of a wife. But when the wagon train arrives, the whole town falls silent. The bride is not a gentle figure, but a woman strong enough to make bulls submit. From that moment, his life takes a new direction. A lonely rancher carves a wooden ring, believing that happiness can be shaped by his own hands. The late spring wind blows across the grasslands, carrying the smell of firewood smoke mixed with the scent of cottonwood resin. At the edge of Willow Creek, Eli Cutter's small ranch stands quiet in the middle of the prairie. During the past winter, he lived in silence, with only the creaking fence and the sound of cattle breathing in the dark. Eli was used to being alone, but that did not mean it stopped hurting. On some nights, sitting by the stove, he could hear the emptiness around him, like wind rushing through the mountains. His parents had died early in an epidemic, and his siblings had scattered elsewhere, leaving Eli with this piece of land. People said he was lucky to keep the ranch, but sometimes that keeping felt like being stuck in a place that only demanded strength and gave nothing back except red dust. During the day, Eli worked slowly against decay, replacing fence posts, tightening wires, adding boards to the cattle shed. At night, he sat at the table, his rough hands carving cottonwood with a knife. Sometimes he made spoons, sometimes small pipes to trade with Silas Boone in town. Other times, he carved just to hear the sound of the knife against the wood, so there would be some sound besides his own breathing. One evening, in the red glow of the fire, Eli began carving a circle from a piece of pale wood, a ring. The idea came suddenly, something small and round, like a wish for someone to be beside him. He smoothed it carefully, the surface becoming brighter, as if a small piece of hope had appeared inside him, even though he had long been used to keeping his pain to himself. Sometime earlier, Eli had gathered the courage to place a small advertisement in the territorial newspaper, "Honest rancher seeking a life partner who values peace." When he wrote it, his hands shook as if he were reaching for something he did not dare to believe in. And then, unexpectedly, a reply arrived. The handwriting leaned unevenly, but was steady, signed by June Carver. She wrote that she had traveled across many roads, breaking horses for cattle drives. The words were not flowery, but beneath the black ink, Eli sensed a loneliness, like the sound of hooves striking the empty ground. June wrote of her dream of having a porch where she could sit and listen to the wind across the fields instead of scattered hoofbeats. There was nothing about looks, nothing about appearance, only emptiness and the longing to belong somewhere. Each evening, Eli read her letters again, her writing carrying the faint warmth of a distant lamp. But even while picturing June, he still carried a shadow in his heart, the fear of being abandoned once more. The feeling from the day his family left. He had buried it deep, but now every word from a stranger brought it back. Was he once again putting his trust in something that might exist only in uncertainty? At dawn, Eli took a few wooden items to town. Silas Boone, the old shopkeeper, liked to tease him. "Howdy, Eli. Stocking up on salt and a little lead shot again?" He squinted, his chin whiskers twitching. "Just salt," Eli answered quietly. "And a little wood polish. Reckon the weather's kinder this season." Silas chuckled, leaning closer. "Rumor says there's a mail-order bride coming down at the station." "You bet?" Eli lowered his face, cheeks burning. "Rumors run faster than a man's horse." The old man chuckled, but his eyes still showed a trace of sympathy. In this small town, everyone knew Eli as if he were part of the land. Diligent, quiet, and with no one believing that a woman would ever choose to sit under that porch roof. That evening, Eli returned again to his silent house. On the table, the wooden ring still lay unfinished. He turned it in his hand, the smooth surface catching the flicker of light from the coal stove. In the long silence, at times he could hear his own heartbeat, sounding both like a reminder and a question. Outside, the fields lay still, the night sky opening with countless stars. Eli told himself that perhaps a person cannot live forever in emptiness. Perhaps someone, just as lonely as he was, would come. But until those footsteps truly landed on this red dust land, it was still only a small wooden ring and a promise whose fate was unknown. The mail-order bride arrived, and the whole town fell silent at the sight of her unexpected figure. That noon, the sun stood high like a hot coin pressed to the forehead. In front of Boone's Mercantile, the old canvas awning flapped as the wind spun up little dust devils along the main street. Marshal Luke Grady leaned his shoulder against a post, hands clasped in front of him, looking off into the distance. Doc Larkin chewed tobacco, occasionally spitting a dark stain onto the ground, the brim of his wide hat shading half of his lazy eyes. Mrs. Kittredge carefully pulled back the curtain of the small church window across the street, peeking out like a curious sparrow. The whip cracked lightly, just enough. The stagecoach came to a stop, wheels grinding over gravel with a dry sound. No one spoke right away. Silence in this land had its own way. It waited, pressed down, lingered, then broke into sighs or murmurs. The door swung open. The driver tipped his hat. A dark leather suitcase was handed down first. Then June Carver stepped onto the steps. Her traveling dress did nothing to make her look smaller. She stood nearly as tall as any large man in the region. Her shoulders were broad and straight. Her thick-soled boots were worn along the edges as if they had crossed many gravel roads and windy passes. On her palms, calluses showed pale, like the sheen of horse hooves. She stood upright, took a slow breath, and looked over the town with the eyes of someone used to reading the ground before mounting a saddle. A grunt sounded from somewhere. Harlan Pike rode out of an alley, pulling the reins to stop his black stallion across the street. He smirked, the smirk of a man too familiar with measuring everything by muscle. "Cutter," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough. "You ain't told us your bride was a heavy hand." Then he burst into laughter, as if he had just thrown a rope neatly over a calf's neck. Eli stood at the bottom of the steps, his hand unconsciously reaching into the pocket where the wooden ring lay. Suddenly, it felt small, like a secret too fragile to show in the sunlight. He wasn't prepared for that height, that breadth, that solidity. But what unsettled him most was the calm in June's eyes. No challenge, no awkwardness, only a quiet gaze, like someone looking at water to judge its depth. "Evening, sir," she spoke first, her voice low but not harsh. No one corrected her that it was still noon. In this land, time was often measured by shadows, not by a clock's hands. Eli nodded, his throat dry as if he had just swallowed a handful of dust. He reached for the suitcase. June's hand was already on the handle. For a moment, her hand covered his, warm, firm, and careful. Both of them let go afterward, as if afraid of dropping something invisible. Silas Boone gave a snorting laugh, hinting, "Much obliged for giving us old folks something to watch today." Then he tilted his head slightly, like a quiet blessing. "To the both of you." Marshal Luke only lifted his chin, a gesture that carried the weight of 100 good lucks. Doc Larkin said nothing, but his teeth pressed tighter, as if holding back a comment that might snap the fragile string of silence. The road back to the ranch was not long, but that afternoon the wind cut across, dust settling in a thin layer on their coats. Eli tied June's suitcase behind the saddle and walked the horse so she wouldn't sway too much. They went a long while without speaking. Somewhere, a few meadowlarks sang, their voices falling like golden flecks into the grass. "Reckon the town is quiet," June said, without looking at him. "Quiet, if you're used to quiet," Eli replied. He wanted to ask her about the horses she had broken, about the roads she had traveled, but his throat stayed dry. The silence lingered between them like a blanket, heavy but not suffocating. At the ranch gate, Eli unlocked it. The cattle pen was clean, carrying just enough of the warm smell of dry hay and manure. The vegetable garden was lined neatly like a schoolboy's notebook, with some bean vines already finding the strings. Firewood was stacked high and orderly, ready for the stormy seasons. Willow Creek slipped past the reeds, glimmering like a blade of light under the sun. June stood on the porch, removing her gloves one finger at a time. She glanced toward the north fence. The wire sagged, and one post looked rotted at the base. The glance was quick, pure instinct of someone used to reading land boundaries and the habits of the wind. Then she turned back toward the house, her look lingering a breath longer. "Much obliged for the ride, Mr. Cutter," she said, placing her suitcase softly on the porch floor, as if careful not to scratch the boards that had been scrubbed smooth. "You must be tired." Eli opened the door. Inside, the house was simple, poor but clean. On the table, the small wooden items he had made were neatly stored in a box. The cast-iron kettle was still warm, with a faint scent of peppermint tea. He poured it into a cup and slid it toward her. June held the cup with both hands, her eyes softening a little as the heat touched her skin. No compliment, no exclamation, only the light exhale of someone who had been away too long. Supper was simple: cornbread, some salted meat, a few crisp cucumbers. They ate slowly. The sound of the spoon against the bowl was faint in a room that held almost nothing but the rhythm of their breathing. At times, Eli wanted to talk about the newborn calves, wanted to mention that he had planted another row of squash because he'd heard squash held up well in the wind. But each thought died out before leaving his lips, like a matchstick snuffed in the breeze. June set the cup down, her fingers brushing the rim of the porcelain. "The stove is warm," she said, more like a remark to herself. Eli only answered, He was afraid that adding more words might break the fragile moment they had. Some things could only exist within silence. Outside, the sky turned the color of honey. The wind eased, clouds drifted low as if about to touch the tips of the grass. Far off, a cow called to its calf across a stretch of water. June stood up and walked to the porch. She stopped at the doorway, her head tilted slightly, listening to the sounds of the new land the way a horse trainer listens to judge the temper of a colt. Eli stood behind her, his hand unconsciously still touching the pocket of his shirt. "The North Post," June said, then paused and left the thought unfinished. Eli nodded, though she didn't turn back. "I'll brace it tomorrow." He said it, but inside he knew more would be needed than bracing. Some posts had to be pulled up, replaced, driven deeper, tightened, and checked every morning. The land did not forgive patchwork fixes. A small dust devil spun across the yard, then faded just before the patch of foxtail grass, like the trick of a tired child. June watched it, the corner of her mouth shifting, not quite a smile. Maybe she was like that swirl of dust, moving far, turning often, then suddenly wanting to stop somewhere that would no longer blow her away. "How long have you been here?" she asked softly. "Long enough to know the smell of every season," Eli replied. Then silence. Then, as if remembering, he added, "But not long enough to forget what it feels like when people leave." On the porch, the wind passed through, asking nothing, offering no comfort. June turned the teacup in her hand, the warmth already gone. She set it down and glanced into the side room, where there was a single wooden bed and an empty chest. When she turned back, her eyes paused briefly on the wooden box on the table, where the ring lay, then moved on, politely, as if she hadn't noticed. "Tomorrow," she said, "if you ain't busy, I'd like to walk around, check the water lines, check the pasture." Eli nodded. "At dawn." "You bet." That was enough for the first day. No promises, no further touch. Only a porch roof dividing the darkness evenly for two people, and a tiny needle stitching together two distant pieces of cloth. To the north, the fence wire shivered with a thin sound, like a broken string in the wind. No one heard it clearly but the prairie. Yet both of them, in their own way, turned their heads toward it. Above, a hawk circled high, its shadow brushing the grass like a reminder. Tomorrow would come in its own way, slow, dry, and without explanation. Eli closed the door, leaving behind the smell of warm grass and the sound of water trickling over stones. In his shirt pocket, the wooden ring lay still, small as a thought not yet spoken. And in the quiet house, one more breath joined the old ones. Not loud, not bright, but real. Rumors spread faster than the prairie wind. turning love into the town's joke. Morning in Red Butte always carried a half-town, half-country feel. The small church bell rang softly, mixing with the rattle of wagons along the dusty road. Since the moment June Carver stepped down from the stagecoach, the whole town had found a new subject to chew over again and again. During choir practice, Mrs. Kittredge craned her neck to whisper, her voice spreading quickly, like the scent of fresh soap. "She's as big as a Clydesdale mare. Truly, I've never seen a woman with shoulders that broad." Another woman giggled, and then the group bent back over their hymn books, though their eyes kept darting toward one another. The whispers spread like dust in the wind, slipping into every porch and every morning coffee. The children were the quickest to speak out. Pete Loomis, a skinny boy who always led the others, pointed toward June as she stood outside the general store buying salt. "Look at her, big as the mule my grandpa raised." There was giggling, followed by a sharp tug on the boy's ear from his mother. But the laughter had already broken out, cutting into the air like a dull knife. June said nothing, only gripped the bag of salt tighter in her hand, eyes straight ahead as she walked on. Eli heard it all. He stood not far away, feeling as if something heavy was pressing against his chest. Small words, tossed out by a child, suddenly became weights hanging from his shoulders. People had laughed at him enough already, laughed at his thin frame, at his lack of strength. Now they laughed again, because the woman he had brought home was not what they expected. That afternoon, Harlan Pike rode his black stallion across the field. The deep sunlight made the horse's back shine like freshly polished leather. Harlan stopped right at the gate, smirking. "Cutter, this Creekside land's got good grass. Sell it to me. You ain't strong enough to hold it." The Pike brothers stood behind him, snickering, their short laughs sharp as an axe striking a dry stump. Eli clenched his fists, eyes fixed on the patch of ground at his feet. He wanted to say something, but his throat felt clogged with dust. June stood in the yard, her hands still carrying the scent of hay, watching. She didn't step in, only wiped the sweat from her forehead in silence. That silence weighed more than 1,000 words. That evening, they sat at the small wooden table. The oil lamp cast a dull yellow light, their shadows stretching long across the wall. Eli served cornbread, salted meat, and a few boiled beans. He said quietly, "Please sit, ma'am." June nodded, sitting down with her hands folded on the table. "Thank you. The cornbread smells like home." But the compliment fell into the space between them. They ate slowly, the sound of spoons and forks barely audible. Neither of them found many words. There was something both warm and uneasy, like two mismatched planks pressed together, still leaving a crack in between. After supper, June stood on the porch, her eyes fixed on the northern field. The thin moonlight fell across the fence, its shadow broken in patches. One post was rotted, the wire sagging like a scar. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "That spot doesn't look steady." Eli swallowed dryly and answered, "I'll brace it tomorrow." His words were short, but inside, he knew the truth. Bracing wouldn't be enough. The post was rotten at the root, like a trust that had long since worn out. He remembered Harlan's words, "Ain't strong enough to hold it." They echoed, twined with the sound of wind whistling through the fence, turning into a refrain that wouldn't fade. June turned back and caught Eli's eyes. For a brief moment, their gazes met, but both pulled away like someone who had accidentally touched hot coals. One side fearful of his weakness, the other weighed down by the feeling of being watched like something strange. That night, Eli lay awake, tossing and turning. The darkness in the room felt thick, like a damp blanket. In the next room, he could hear June shifting, the wooden bed creaking. In that silence, he realized, his greatest fear wasn't a broken fence or losing the land. His greatest fear was that this woman, too, would leave, like all the others had. He wasn't sure his heart could endure being abandoned one more time. Outside, the wind swept across, making the northern wire hum. The sound was like a string pulled too tight, warning of a note about to snap. Eli lay still, eyes wide open in the dark, knowing that this wind was only the beginning. When the wild bull broke through the fence, everyone expected Eli to step forward, but the one who saved the town was the new bride. Dawn came slowly, like someone weary. Along the northern edge, the wind moved through the foxtail grass, the barbed wire humming with thin notes before falling silent. June rose first, stepping out onto the porch, reaching for the gloves hanging there. The sky was still pale, as though washed through a thin layer of mist. Eli lit the stove, the smell of black coffee spreading slowly through the house. Neither of them spoke. A new day began in silence, the kind of silence prairie folk often learn to be grateful for. A sharp cracking sound suddenly came from the north, the kind of sound not loud, but enough to raise the hairs on one's neck. Then another, like bones snapping under a boot. June lifted her head. Eli dropped his cup and ran into the yard, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. The northern fence post had fallen. The wire sagged wide open like a fresh wound torn apart. Through the gap, a massive dark shape had pushed through, horns held high, breath steaming white in the morning mist. Blue Thunder, the breeding bull. Nearly 2,000 pounds, temper hot as late summer storm clouds. It didn't stop at the edge of the grass. It thundered across the road, smashing aside a stack of Silas's old crates, then headed straight for the garden behind the church, where Mrs. Kittredge had been tending her roses for Decoration Day. The church bell suddenly rang hard, swinging across the street like a flock of startled birds. Marshal Luke blew his whistle, the shrill sound painting the air with panic. "Stand back, y'all!" someone shouted. Harlan Pike's cowboys rushed to throw their ropes, lassos whirling through the air, but missing, only slicing through rose bushes now shredded to pieces. Mrs. Kittredge stood on the steps, clutching her apron, her voice hoarse with fury. "That devil! Who let it out?" But her words were drowned out by Blue Thunder's breathing, each snort pounding like a hammer against a drum. Eli stopped at the fence, his heart beating as if it might crack his ribs. The crowd's eyes turned toward him, hot, sharp, and unforgiving. He felt himself shrinking, like a shadow stretched thin under the sun. His fingers rubbed together unconsciously, then clenched tight to keep from shaking. There are moments when a man understands, with cruel clarity, that he ain't strong enough to do what the world demands. June passed by him without force or hurry. She only pulled her gloves on tighter, buttoned the collar of her shirt, then stepped down from the fence, swinging a leg over as if entering a ripe field, careful not to break a stalk. "Don't," Eli breathed, but the word was already carried off by the wind. She walked straight toward the bull, carrying no rope, no stick. The crowd fell silent, as if someone had gripped all their throats at once. Doc Larkin muttered a curse that broke the hush. Pete Loomis, not knowing fear, had crept close to the fence. His foot slipped into a shallow ditch, and his small body pitched forward. Blue Thunder tossed its head, the whites of its eyes flashing, breath snorting hard. June leaned slightly, her right hand raised diagonally, just enough to block the animal's line of sight from the boy. No one noticed she was shielding Pete, except Eli. He saw it all. "Easy now, big fella. Easy." June's voice was low, steady, like an old army blanket. "Ain't nobody fixin' to hurt ya." She did not look the bull directly in the eye, but fixed her gaze at the space between its horns and ears. Her steps were slow, each boot heel tapping the ground faintly, carrying the rhythm of a calm heartbeat. Blue Thunder stamped once, hooves tearing the earth, dirt flying onto her skirt, but she did not change her pace. Eli could hear the silence. It had its own sound, the sound of things shifting from tense to calm, from breaking to mending. June closed the distance, 10 steps, then 5, then 3. She stretched out her left hand, palm open, empty, and held it there for a long moment, like a hymn slowed down. "That's it," she whispered. "We're not enemies." The bull lowered its head slightly, its ears twitching. June stepped back half a pace, giving it room to breathe. Then she moved forward half a step again. A small gesture, but it spoke a language not many had the patience to learn. Just behind the left ear, where the animal often itched under the sun, was where she reached. Her calloused fingers touched hair, then skin, then warmth. She scratched lightly, in circles, slow and steady. Blue Thunder exhaled a long breath, its head sinking lower. In the crowd, someone gasped, as if surfacing from water. Mrs. Kittredge stopped scolding, her hands falling from her apron. Marshal Luke lowered his whistle. Harlan Pike pulled on his reins, his brow furrowing into a crease hard to name. "Silas!" June didn't turn her head, but her voice was clear. "Lend me a rope." Silas was already standing behind Eli, no one knew since when. He tossed her a loop. June caught it as if she had done it 1,000 times, tying it into a simple halter. She didn't yank. She placed it, then asked. The bull, strangely enough, stood still, as if willing to accept such courtesy. And just like that, it followed her out of the garden, each step easing the pounding hearts of the onlookers. The crowd parted, opening a path. Rose petals lay crushed under the bull's hooves, red as bruises. Pete Loomis clutched his mud-stained knees, eyes wide, suddenly too afraid to move. Eli pulled the boy back, placing him behind, his hand firm but gentle on his shoulder. Past the gate, June stopped, running her hand softly along Blue Thunder's muzzle. "That's good," she murmured, as if to a child waking from a nightmare. Then she handed the rope to Marshal Luke. "The church needs its quiet." Harlan spurred his horse forward, glancing at Eli before turning to June, his tone half mocking, half dry. "What kind of trick was that, Carver?" June brushed the dust from her sleeve, giving a faint smile, tired but not sharp. "No trick. Don't shout at a frightened animal. It hears the wind better than it hears yelling." Silas cleared his throat, as if to cover an amused laugh. Marshal Luke nodded, tipping the brim of his hat. "Much obliged, ma'am. You saved the rose garden and the church's honor." Mrs. Kittredge looked at the ruined rose bed, then at June, her eyes softening like soil touched by water. The bouquet she held slipped from her hands without her noticing. Eli stood by the gate, realizing the cold sweat on his back had long since dried. He couldn't say a word, but inside something had shifted, like an ember suddenly flaring with a green flame. Not because June had saved him, but because of the way she had walked through that crowd, without begging, without boasting. She chose silence where it belonged, and spoke when it mattered. As the crowd dispersed, the dust settled slowly like ashes. June walked past Eli, pausing for half a beat. She looked north, where the fence gaped like an unfinished story. "The north post is weak at the base," she said, her voice level as still water. "We should replace it, not brace it, before it decides to go wandering again." Eli nodded. There were so many things he wanted to say. Thanks, apologies, promises. But in the end, only a small slipped out, quiet enough to be swallowed by the wind. June asked for nothing more. She simply took off her gloves, shook off the dust, and hung them back on the rusty nail by the porch. Her movement neat, like a period closing a long sentence. The town returned to its usual rhythm, but inside everyone, a new strand of wire had been strung, between doubt and respect, between whispers and silence. And inside Eli, a very small faith had begun to sprout, small like a seed of grass that had slept through winter and now warmed awake. Maybe, just maybe, a stranger as lonely as he was had just shown him how to stand still in the storm, so that the storm would tire itself out and pass. Each strike of June's hammer into the wooden posts landed straight onto Eli's pride. By late afternoon, the sun pulled back from the hills, leaving streaks of red like dying embers. At the edge of the ranch, the hammer blows rang heavy against dry wood, sounding like a heart working to stay steady. June stood at the northern fence, bare hands gripping the sledgehammer, each swing firm as if she had known the work all her life. Every post she drove sank deeper until the earth swallowed it tight, leaving no gap for the wind to slip through. Rumors spread faster than the wind. People came out to the Cutter Ranch with the excuse of helping, but their eyes were more like those of folks at a fair. The Pike brothers brought a case of beer, popping the caps loudly as though waiting for a show. Pete Loomis carried a shovel, grinning wide, eager to witness something out of the ordinary. Even Mrs. Kittredge appeared, hiding her mouth behind a paper fan, her eyes missing not a single swing of the hammer. Eli kept his head down, pulling the barbed wire, sweat soaking the back of his shirt. He knew well enough what those eyes were saying. A man letting his new bride handle the heavy work in his place. Every laugh, Every swallow of beer from the pikes felt like a knife stabbing into the sorest part of his pride. Harlan Pike rode his horse slowly around, his voice mocking. "Cutter, letting the ma'am do it all. Don't that look odd? You planning to live off her?" The young men burst into loud laughter. Eli didn't raise his head. He only gripped the wire tighter, letting the barbs prick his hands until they bled. Another Pike spoke up, pretending politeness. "Ma'am, let me take the post hole digger. Heavy work ain't suited for a lady." June paused her hammering, turned her head, her eyes straight as an axe splitting wood. "I've got the rhythm in my hands. Much obliged. But you go help Mr. Cutter with the wire." The group fell silent for a few seconds. The young man froze, his pride torn open, before letting out an awkward laugh. People turned to Eli, waiting for his reaction, waiting for him to break under the invisible weight. Eli bent even lower, shoulders curling like wood bent by fire. But inside, he felt another kind of wind, painful, yet carrying a trace of warmth. June hadn't spoken for him, hadn't used sharp words to block their laughter. She simply stood there, her hammer steady, lending him her strength by working at his side, not shielding him. The sun slanted into long blades, their shadows falling across the grass. The sound of the hammer struck in rhythm, each post set firmly in line. The northern fence slowly closed, like a wound, knitting back together. The crowd slowly dispersed. The beer was gone, the show was over, and people left behind only dust and half-finished laughter. On the grass remained nothing but wind and the smell of freshly turned earth. Eli stood breathing hard, his hands bloodied, his shirt soaked through. He turned to June. She was sweating as well, but her stance was still steady. In the silence between them, neither spoke. Only their eyes met, enough to understand that the fence had been built not only to hold the cattle, but to give two lonely people a place to stand together without collapsing under the weight of others' words. It was a moment that seemed ordinary, but in Eli's heart, it was calm, like the sky after a storm has just passed. The shame not gone, but in the ashes flickered a faint belief that sometimes surviving the laughter of others didn't require shouting, only standing side by side until the long shadows drew short again. A wooden ring that did not quite fit, but was enough to open the promise of walking together instead of casting shade. Night fell like an old blanket, thick and a little damp. On the porch, the oil lamp flickered, its wavering yellow light throwing their shadows across the wooden wall. The sound of insects in the field played steadily, like background music filling the space that words had left empty. Eli sat, hunched on a wooden chair, his thin hands clasped on his knees, twisting together. June sat opposite, an empty chair still between them, a distance as wide as the open prairie. Eli spoke softly, as if afraid of the sound of his own voice. "I ain't as strong as folks expect. Here, they measure a man by his arms." I knew I'd lost from the first time I heard their laughter. June didn't turn to him, her eyes lifted to the star-filled sky. Her voice was low, flat as a still lake. "All my life I've been treated like a wager. Everyone wanted to beat me in a contest of strength. People never saw me as a woman, just a test horse, a bull to be brought down. I'm tired." Both fell silent. A light breeze passed, carrying the scent of cottonwood and stove smoke. Eli drew in a deep breath. Then, gathering all his courage, he said, "But today, when Blue Thunder broke the fence, I ran to find you. Not for pride. Because I trusted you'd do right. That's something." June tilted her head, her eyes softening a little. "You're hoping for a partner, not a shadow." Eli searched his shirt pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, its edges worn smooth. He opened it. Inside was a cottonwood ring, its surface polished like a clear stream in early morning. He held it out, hesitant, as if handing over his whole heart. June looked at it, her eyes suddenly lighting up with the brightness of a child's. She tried it on. The ring stopped at the second knuckle, not slipping past. June laughed, the first true laugh since she had arrived in Red Butte. "Pretty as a windless morning. Doesn't fit, but pretty." Eli blushed, mumbling, "I worked on it for 3 months. Since the day I read your first letter." June turned the ring slowly, her voice measured. 3 months carving something you believed in. Reckon that's your true nature." In that moment, The night breeze softened. June closed the wooden box and placed it back in Eli's hand. "Listen to me. If you truly mean it, ask me properly. Then we'll resize the ring. Together. I'll teach you about cattle, horses. You teach me wood, the stove, the saddle. Each of us with our share, neither heavier than the other." Eli stood, his eyes brighter than the oil lamp. He turned, kneeling on the porch floor, his voice trembling but firm. "June Carver, will you marry me? Not for what people say, but because I believe we can build something better than standing alone." June was silent for a long beat, the wind carrying the scent of hay across the porch. Then she nodded, whispering, "Yes, on one condition. We always ask each other before every big decision, and never let Harlan's laughter sit at our supper table." Eli let out a quiet laugh, awkward in the night, but sincere. He took her hand. June's hand was calloused, Eli's thin and frail, but when they joined, they fit strangely well, and the night was no longer cold. In a land where men were measured by muscle, they proved there was a strength gentler than a sledgehammer. 6 months passed, and Wyoming's land turned a deep red. The cottonwoods along the creek lit up with yellow leaves, then burned bright red like embers left in a stove. The autumn wind was cold but sweet, blowing across the new fence, posts driven deep, standing straight as an oath not easily broken. The Cutter Ranch had changed skin. The cattle pen was clean, the garden green, the calves healthy under June's care. Blue Thunder, the bull that had once caused havoc, was calmer now, grazing quietly, sometimes lifting its head toward the porch as if remembering the woman whose whisper had tamed it. One morning, Marshal Luke stopped by to buy salted meat. He stood by his horse, looking at the northern fence, straight as a freshly sharpened knife. "You've done well, Eli." Eli nodded slightly, his eyes glinting with joy at seeing their shared work recognized. Another afternoon, Doc Larkin led a limping packhorse over. "June, this one's gone off step. I can't fix it. Take a look." June laid her hand on the horse's tendon, her eyes calm, the same calm she'd had the day she gentled Blue Thunder. Doc nodded, no trace of mocking left, only trust. As for Silas Boone, he chuckled and clapped Eli on the shoulder. "That woodwork of yours is smooth now as a hymn. I'll order a few more benches for the stage stop." Eli smiled, knowing in his heart that every jeer had been replaced by respect. On the wedding day, the Red Butte chapel bells rang long and clear. Reverend Amos Pratt gave a simple blessing. Townsfolk crowded inside, some curious, some kind. Among them, Harlan Pike stood with his arms crossed, his face stern. When Eli looked up, Harlan gave only a nod. No words, but his eyes carried recognition. An unspoken apology, enough to ease Eli's heart. Mrs. Kittredge held a bouquet of roses, her eyes glistening. "June, you saved my garden from being destroyed again. Much obliged." June smiled gently and replied, "I only spoke softly to it. Sometimes a fierce creature is only afraid." Eli turned to the congregation, his voice low but steady. "And I've learned, there is a kind of strength that doesn't lie in a sledgehammer." After the ceremony, the wind moved through the foxtail grass, carrying the faint ringing of horseshoes fading into the distance. On June's hand, the cottonwood ring had been resized to fit perfectly, polished bright like an autumn lake. Quietly, she gave Eli a matching wooden band she had carved herself, etched with a lariat pattern, the mark of 2 ropes tied into one. In a land where men were still measured by muscle and loud voices, Eli and June had found strength in calm, trust, and respect. The Cutter Ranch was no longer just a piece of land, but proof that when 2 people know how to take turns holding the reins, they can lead the whole herd across the shallows. As evening fell, autumn sunlight scattered down like golden dust. On the ranch porch, hammer and chisel hung beside the saddle. 2 trades joined together to form a home. And the prairie, wide and wild, seemed to echo an answer. Loneliness can swallow a lifetime, but if you find a hand willing to hold yours, even dust and wind can become a roof. Under the western sky, as autumn winds swept across the grasslands and the chapel bells still lingered in memory, we see that every loneliness can find its way out if there is a hand willing to hold on. Eli and June never outmuscled anyone. They simply chose to trust and to stand together. That, too, is how we mend the quiet wounds of life, by listening, respecting, and sharing, no matter how small. If this story brings you a bit of warmth in days filled with red dust, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever found such gentle strength in your own life? Share it. Perhaps your words will be a small flame that warms someone else reading this.